Bristol Festival of Ideas event this evening. I'm Julian Baggini, and I'm really pleased to be chairing this discussion this evening. The central question really can be summed up in a line from Owen Flanagan's book, The Bodhisattva's Brain, where he says, is it possible to take an ancient, comprehensive philosophy like Buddhism, subtract the hocus-pocus, and have a worthwhile philosophy for 21st century scientifically informed secular thinkers? And I think there were lots of questions raised by that, one of which may have already popped into your mind, which is hocus pocus, really? Buddhism? We'll go into that a bit later. Owen Flanagan is a professional academic philosopher, but don't let that put you off. He's, I think, very unusual, not very unusual, but I think he's in a minority in his profession, in that rather than simply just trying to sort of like find the latest new riff to put on an old argument for the sake of generating new papers, it seems when you read his work you have a sense of someone who is genuinely trying to find the right answers to genuinely interesting questions which might matter to us, and certainly his work on Buddhism is an example of that. We're also joined by Tim Lott, who you know, novelist, memoirist, and that's a column in the Guardian family section every week, and so I'm sure his work is known to you all. And Tim, I'm going to start with you there, because I suppose people who may not know about your interest in Zen, you've written a couple of pieces on this, and it comes up in your work from time to time. You wrote some lengthy essays for Eon, which is a very good online publication, if anyone's seen that. And you spoke about Alan Watts in particular, and how his ideas of Zen influenced you. So perhaps just to start us off, you can say a little bit about how Zen and Buddhism sort of came into your life.
Yeah, well, I had a nervous breakdown when I was about 30 years old, and it went completely balmy. And they say something similar happens when they take you to a Zen monastery and they hit you with a stick every time you try and do something spontaneous. That you get utterly bewildered and lost, and you kind of have a breakdown, you drive to a breakdown, and you kind of start from ground zero. And I was a bit like that, so I kind of had to, wipe my slate clean, and had to build my personality up from kind of nothing again. And I started off by doing this via a woman called Dorothy Rowe, who's a psychologist, a very good psychologist, but also a sort of self-help guru. And I became friends with her and read all her books about depression and and it was very interesting. I having read them all and just being very impressed by what she had to say. And I'm not going to go into what she had to say, but at the end of it, she said, "Did you know I'm a Buddhist?" And I said, "Well, no, you never mention it. And normally anybody who kind of writes about that kind of thing is quite bigs it up, and goes, I'm very Buddhist." And she never mentions it in her books. She says it's just philosophical Buddhism. And you should read this guy called Alan Watts, who was a kind of figure who was born in 1915. This is centenary next year, for those of you without a mathematical brain. And I started reading him. He is basically not just an interpreter of Zen, but of Taoism, Vedanta, Hinduism, and he was mainly operational or working between the 1930s and the 1970s when he died. And I just think this guy is absolutely brilliant, and he changed the way I thought about the world entirely. He kind of explained it to me, and no one has ever really explained the world to me before. I just thought it was a chaotic series of incomprehensible events. And I'm enormously grateful to him, and so that's how I came to Alan Watts and to Eastern philosophy in general.
But you said in the piece though that your preconceptions were very much about sort of all sorts of strange Tibetan rituals and things like that. But what you took from Buddhism for you had nothing to do with that at all.
I'm a massive skeptic. I believe in science and reason. I have no interest in superstition, and neither does Alan Watts. He's not interested in any of those things, and I'm not interested in any of those things. So his interpretations of Buddhist philosophy, which were entirely secular, way before other people. I now know there have been, a number of people writing about this. But he was, back in the day, doing this way ahead of the game. And that's why I was so drawn to him, because I'm a skeptic, I'm a secularist. You know, so I don't have any supernatural ideas about the world.
So can you give us perhaps just an example of a particular thing from Zen which you adopted, which was useful, effective, worked, not a trace of superstition in it?
Okay, well that's quite a complicated question. But if one of the things about Zen, and as I say, he covered a number of philosophies, but one of the things about Zen was about having Zen asked you to react spontaneously, to not think. And I think I was listening to a program on the radio the other day talking about how some forms of depression in Africa translate the word they use is for overthinking, which is kind of what I did. And it was really about learning to react in a spontaneous way to events and trust them, rather than trying to think everything through, which is kind of what we're doing here tonight, is trying to think everything through. And what I spend my life doing as a writer, I sit in a room and think, and it can drive you nuts. And this is a kind of antidote to that. It's just saying, just do it. Just get your mind into a condition where you can trust your brain to respond to events. And maybe you'll make a mistake, maybe you won't. But the fact is, it's the best bet you've got, is just to respond quickly, and as the Zen master said, go left, go right, but don't wobble. That's the general thing that I get out of it.
Yeah, well, of course, Buddhism comes in various stripes and everything, so I think it just goes without saying here that sometimes we'll be talking about different forms of it, and it should be taken as read that unless someone says so explicitly, it's not meant to be a generalisation about all Buddhism. But, turning to you for a bit, Tim there was describing ideas, and a lot of people have the kind of, when you talk about Buddhism, they often contrast it with religion. They say that, no, it's not a religion, it is essentially a philosophy, and it's not superstitious. Now, in your book, you're immensely, I think, respectful in the correct way towards Buddhism, in that you treat it entirely seriously and ask what it has to offer. But at the same time, you don't pull your punches when you use terms like hocus pocus, and you say some parts are superstitious nonsense. So, what are these superstitious elements that you want to get rid of, and how big are they really? Can they be dismissed as just little accretions on the side, or how central are they?
Well, thank you. It's great to be here. It's nice to hear about Alan Watts, because the first Buddhism I was introduced to is I read Alan Watts and D.K. Suzuki when I was in college in the late 60s in New York, and nothing stuck. But I was aware that there were these alternative traditions which were quite interesting and beautiful. Let me answer Julian's question by telling a little bit about how I also got interested in Buddhism, or the Buddhisms, because I did find out actually through my meetings with Buddhists and my developing interest in Buddhism that there's only Buddhisms. There's at least as many varieties of Buddhism as there are types of, say, Christianity. And in fact, the Dalai Lama asked me to explain to him what unifies Christians, and it was actually surprisingly hard to do that. And I think the same thing is true among the Buddhisms. But I had a kind of a wonderful experience. In 2000, I was invited by the Dalai Lama to go to his home in North India, Dharamsala, India, to talk with him about consciousness, because of some work I had done on consciousness. And I got there, and there were 6 or 7 other scientists. They called me a scientist too, but I'm not a scientist. Most of whom were neuroscientists, and they were interested in the effects of meditation and how to study consciousness scientifically. And here was the Dalai Lama, the leader of a great world spiritual tradition, also interested in this. And he's this particular Dalai Lama is very, very interested in science. So I was struck on the one hand by the idea that, as a nice Catholic, there's an inner Catholic boy in me still trying to get out. I thought, this is like sitting with the Pope. The Pope would never want to talk to me about science. But here we were talking about science. And so I started to sort of think through this question of what would make a religion, or Julian asked, is Buddhism a religion or philosophy? What would make something that looks like I call it a comprehensive philosophical tradition, but it certainly has religious elements because there is this idea of an afterlife, for example. There isn't usually, among most of the Buddhisms, a commitment to a creator God. So many people say, of course, that Buddhism is atheistic by our Abrahamic standards, in the sense that that's usually not a feature of it. On the other hand, at least in Tibetan Buddhism, there are often ghosts and spirits, bodhisattvas flying on lotus leaves, and numerous reincarnations. So I remember asking His Holiness or his team, I said, how many reincarnations approximately does a person have? And I was told this. I was told, imagine a mountain range 84,000 times larger than the Himalayas. And imagine that each morning you go and you touch it with a soft piece of cloth, the closest part of the mountain range. And think that each time you touch it, that's one life. As many lives as it will take you to make the entire mountain range a road is how many lives you'll have before your final release into nirvana. So I was in this laboratory in India with a great world spiritual leader who, on the one hand, said things that made it clear to me that he believed in afterlives, or he indicated that he did believe in afterlives. And as a sort of a scientifically minded secular person, I thought, well, that's kind of strange to really believe in that. So that was the kind of thing I thought was superstitious. Now, but the problem with saying that is it depends on whether or not it really is believed, as opposed to just part of a created picture that makes the universe understandable and comprehensible, as opposed to something like the creeds that I was brought up with, right? Where I actually said in the Nicene Creed, I think it is, I believe in God the Father, Almighty Creator of heaven and earth. There isn't something like that in the Buddhisms. There aren't creeds like that. So one has to sort of figure out, in answering this question, is it a philosophy or religion? Do these people actually literally believe in the things that they say, or is it part of just a general mythic way of comprehending life? In which case, it's not so much hocus pocus; it's something else.
Yeah. And presumably the answer to that is it depends on the time and the place and the people. But the project of the book is to see whether there can be what you call a naturalized Buddhism, where there's a Buddhism which is consistent with our naturalistic worldview, which you define as saying naturalism means that what there is and all there is natural stuff, and everything that happens has a set of natural causes that produce it. You may want to say a bit more about that. But why is it so important? I mean, the underlying assumption here seems to be that if we can't make Buddhism consistent with this, then we kind of have to get rid of Buddhism. What is it that puts that onus so strongly on it? What is it that's so compelling about naturalism, which means that we kind of, want to go and make sure that anything else we believe fits in with that?
Great. So, I should be, since I'm sure most of you haven't read the book, my interest in this particular way of putting it came from two different directions. One is that I was very interested, especially on the left coast of the United States. Almost everybody I meet is a Buddhist. They're either Zen Buddhists or they're Tibetan Buddhists, and almost every American who I meet thinks that Buddhism is primarily about meditation. But I know a lot about Buddhism now, and I know that most Buddhists, actually, in Buddhist countries, don't meditate very much. So, furthermore, when I talk to my American friends who are converting to Buddhism, I'm often struck by the fact that what appeals to them about Buddhism is that it seems so nicely suited for a secular lifestyle. So these are all people who are rejecting their, usually Christian, but actually in Dharamsala there are a lot of people who call themselves Bujus, Buddhist Jews, who go to India. Girls from Brooklyn, you meet there, and they're doing this. So I was struck on the one hand, I thought, so is this really, this Buddhism fad or phase or conversion thing that was going on in America, does it really make sense for secular-minded sort of scientific people to climb on board with Buddhism, and are they climbing on board with all the features of Buddhism? Are they believing things, for example? See, notice Buddhism and say Christianity have the same structure in the following way. At least in the Christianity that I was brought up in, when you die, then God judges you and you go to heaven or hell. In the Buddhist tradition, there's a karmic eschatology, as the theologians would call it, It's just that there's no God that judges you. Somehow the universe keeps track of your moral merit or demerit and then recycles you. You might come back as a sewer rat or a cockroach, and then if you're a good one of those, you make it back up again, and you've got those 84,000 times the size of the Himalaya lives to go through until possibly there's release. And how release, nirvana, is conceptualized is variable. So on the one hand, I was interested in this question about, is this just a fad, or is there something really, really good about Buddhism for secular-minded Western people? I was interested in that. And I thought, if the secular-minded Western people are finding this appealing, is it really suited to people who have, say, scientific and materialistic or naturalistic impulses? I wasn't so much worried about the Buddhists over in Buddha lands, because I thought you're allowed to believe whatever you want, but just most people that I know are already committed to some kind of naturalism. If you're committed to some kind of naturalism, then you've got to work on it. The other reason, though, was internal to Buddhism, because in 2005, shortly after I had met him and I spent several times with the Dalai Lama and some members of his team, he wrote a book called The Universe in a Single Atom, in which he explored how Buddhism relates to cosmology, astrophysics, study of consciousness. And he says at the beginning of the book that Buddhism, unlike other religious traditions, is answerable to science. And this is more or less a quote. He says, Buddhists believe in rebirth, but if science proves that there is no rebirth, we will give it up, we should give it up, and we will give it up. Now that's interesting. The Pope doesn't say that, the Chief Rabbi doesn't say that, the boss Imam doesn't say that, but that was interesting to me. So I thought again that I would try to work out, are there resources, because the other thing about it, it's such a beautiful ethical tradition, and there was so much about its metaphysics I thought were beautiful. So it wasn't as if, Julian, I guess I just put it this way, in sum up. It wasn't that everybody in the world should be a naturalist. It's just that if you're antecedently a naturalist, usually in America, where I come from, people would join societies like secular humanists, or they would become Unitarians. Religions that don't really have any theology. So I was interested if they were joining on to Buddhism, and that was the agenda.
Well, it's interesting, though, that there is this, it seems to me there's a kind of a tension perhaps across the spectrum. On the one hand, there is this desire to sort of use these brain scans and scientific research to vindicate Buddhist ideas. And there's another kind of strand in it which kind of tries to put it in its place. And I think, Tim, if I bring you in here, I mean, when you were writing about Zen and everything, I think it seemed that a lot of what attracted to you about that was that there were some things, at least, for which in Zen and Alan Watts in particular, there was, if you like, a disinterest in what science had to say. It was kind of like saying, look, the science has its place and it's important, but there are aspects of life which we shouldn't even attempt to approach scientifically. Really. It's not anti-science, but it's about kind of not, as it were, seeking that scientific validation.
Well, it suggests that science, for all its glories, Watts and myself are big fans of science and the scientific method and all the amazing things it's produced. He merely pointed out that the basic system that science uses, which is analysis, which is to break things down to their smaller and smaller and smaller particles, right, in order to understand them, in order to manipulate nature, is only one way of understanding the world. And it's not the only way. And he memorably said, look, it's ridiculous to think that you're getting more real as you get smaller. It's no more real at that level than it is at this level, or the bigger level. You can't understand the world simply by pulling it apart. And although science has its place and it's given us this ability to manipulate the world, it's really stolen a large part of our imaginations, because we're trying to see. One of the things I remember when I was growing up in my teenage years was I suppose, just a high point of what you might call root science in the 1950s and 60s. It just stripped all the wonder. All I could see in the world were just these sort of billiard balls bouncing around in an empty void, meaninglessly. And I found it a profoundly depressing view of the universe, and there seems to be no room for wonder or magnificence or curiosity in that. It's just like a giant machine. As I came to understand more things about physics and quantum physics and later forms of physics which weren't taught then, I did begin to understand how the two things which concern the larger pictures as well as the smaller pictures, you could reintegrate it with something that was magical, and I use it in inverted commas, without being magical thinking. You see what I mean? So it gave me a sense of wonder in science, but understood that very reductive way that science can have of looking at the world. For instance, Richard Dawkins took saying we're just robots that carry our genes around. To me, that's an absurd statement, or radical materialists, who believe that consciousness is an illusion. Also an absurd statement to me, because there's nothing realer than consciousness in a way, and you have to have someone to be having the illusion. So this is the kind of typical scientific reductionism that goes on all the time, and it's constantly suggesting two things. Firstly, the world is comprehensible and understandable. It isn't. I really don't think it is. I think it's a mystery. It will always be a mystery. I'm glad that it's a mystery. I'm delighted it's a mystery, because once you've got the world as mystery, you have a pretty boring residue. And secondly, you can't understand the world simply by analysing it. Those are the two things I put out.
Yeah, so in that sense, I'm curious as to what you make of the project to try and sort of, as it were, naturalise Buddhism, because particularly in the Zen tradition you're talking about, you said in that essay that they don't have the same emphasis on the power of language, reason and logic, and often they, as you say, they actively encourage you to stop thinking, to stop analysing and so forth. And if that's the kind of Buddhism you're interested in, are you in danger, in fact, of losing what's in value in it if you start thinking too much about how, actually, perhaps quantum physics can help explain a bit about this ambiguity and so forth? I mean, should you not just sort of keep them in their own domains and never the twain shall meet?
Well, they can be in their own domains. There's nothing, as far as I'm concerned, I mean, there are many forms of Buddhism, and I think people have a lot of preconceptions about it that are often mistaken. But I don't see there's any reason why it's not a question of being in separate domains. In fact, there's nothing in the Zen Buddhism that I understand that stands against science. And you see, and this is according to Alan Watts' interpretation. He didn't really talk, for instance, about karma in terms of rebirth. He had a different interpretation of it. He didn't think of it as this kind of rebirth for him was something that happens throughout your life. For instance, it wasn't something that happened after your death, and he was completely uninterested in the kind of more mystical elements of Buddhism. So I don't think it's a question of them occupying separate fields that necessarily. I think science, in a way, is much more edgy about something like Buddhism than Buddhism, in a way, is about science.
Okay. Now, I want to turn to some more specific things you talk about in the book, Owen, about projects of naturalising Buddhism, and perhaps then for both. I've got two things in mind in particular, but I'd like to sort of see how they do or do not reflect Tim's more sort of practical experience of finding these things useful for living. Because you say when you actually look at Buddhism, you talk about the metaphysics, its account of the world, its epistemology, its account of how we get knowledge, and also its ethics. Now, I think if we were to ask people which of those things they suspect is perhaps most in tune with our more secular ways of thinking, they might have thought the ethics. That's not what you think at all. And in fact, you think that the metaphysics actually has a lot going for it. So I just want to perhaps focus on a couple of examples of that. And for the first one, but you can explain this for us. I mean, the terms you use are this idea of our first nature and our second nature. And this is a very important thing for understanding the kind of creatures we are. And you think Buddhism actually has some insight into that? Perhaps you do.
So the as I said, at least in America, actually Zen is very, very influential in America, although Zen is not even the biggest form of Buddhism in Japan. Pure Land Buddhism is, and actually more Americans of Japanese extraction are Pure Land Buddhists, but there is an interesting divide here between the Japanese Buddhisms, which is, as Julian was saying, tend to be more anti-intellectual, less conceptual on the one side, and then something like Tibetan Buddhism on the other, which is really big into doing philosophizing in a sort of a very highly linguistic sort of sense. There's real variety among these Buddhisms, and I do focus in my book, this is why it's nice to be here with Tim tonight, more on the more sort of heavily intellectual side. So let me just say, so that's a way of answering Julian's question. So when you ask Buddhists about what they centrally believe on the metaphysics side, they'll actually focus on two things that I think are good lessons for us. One is that everything's impermanent, and that's just part of their metaphysics. And I think of that as actually the way a lot of physicists think about things. So, for example, nowadays, a lot of physics is event and process oriented. So even now, the most common view about glass is that it's a slow-moving liquid. It's not a thing. It's a slow-moving liquid. So in that sense, this idea that the universe, and the Dalai Lama will sometimes, for example, say things like, oh, the Big Bang, sure, there might have been a Big Bang, but it's got to be Big Bangs all the way back. Big Bangs before Big Bangs, or very congenial to multiverse theories. And
this whole idea that everything is an event is very sort of strong. I remember thinking that
exactly
startling insight that there aren't essentially, as we imagine, things and events.
That's right.
There's just events, and actually there's not even just events, there's just one event. And that one event is happening now and always has been happening. And that was very, very striking thought for me. Once I started to just think of everything as being one single event happening now, and actually coming out of now, not coming out of the past, as we tend to think of in terms of formal causal reasons, but just happening now. That was a real revelation to me, and I thought about life differently after that.
So yeah, so the I don't know if I'd climb on board with that way of putting it, but yeah, there's this grand unfolding, and it's a processes, and one of the really interesting things I think Buddhism does with this is to say, and I'm part of this grand unfolding, the mother of all unfoldings, and I'm not a permanent thing either. So this is sometimes called the doctrine of no self. And I think it really is a contrast with the way most Abrahamic people think about ourselves, because if you say, what makes Julian the same person over time? One view is, what makes Julian the same guy as he was at 5, 10, 15, and 25 is that he's got the same soul, or what in the Indic traditions we call his Atman. There's the essence, and the essence travels with him as his body changes, and then when his body dies, it can either be reinserted into the next body or go on to his heavenly reward. And Buddhism is very clear about the doctrine of anatman. So everything's impermanent, and I am also one of the impermanent things. And not only is my body impermanent, but my personal identity, who and what I am, is part of the flux. And so I think that is just much more congenial to a naturalistic picture of persons, because if we think of ourselves in a post-Darwinian age as mammals, who are psychobiologically constantly changing in complex social environments which are also unfolding, then we're part of the unfolding. And it does carry over to Buddhist ethical views, because the idea is that the first and foremost sort of duty of a good Buddhist person is to feel compassion for all sentient beings, including oneself. That's a very, very high bar, and that's a beautiful virtue to me. It's something that's, I think, there's no tradition. I do a lot of work nowadays in comparative philosophy, so I've been studying a lot of Confucianism, as well as Western traditions. There's no tradition which emphasizes compassion for all sentient beings to the degree that Buddhism does. The Golden Rule is nothing nearly as demanding as the vow that one takes as a Buddhist, or that one thinks that one has to care for all sentient beings. So those are the aspects that I think are just very, very congenial to modern sensibilities, or ought to be congenial to modern sensibilities.
But Tim, I mean, you were saying how thinking about these things actually helped you in a very personal way. You said you had depression, sort of kind of breakdown. In what way is thinking of yourself as being impermanent helpful? Some people might say that's quite a frightening thought, actually, to think that it might seem to be a fracturing of identity rather than anything else. So how do you find that actually helpful?
Well, I'm not sure that particular aspect of it. I mean, it was something that made me wake up bright and bushy tailed in the morning. And yet there is something beautiful about the idea. You know, the idea that everything, as Alan Watts puts it, is disappearing mist and you can't clutch it, and that impermanence is at the heart of beauty and at the heart of life. There's something lovely in that. You know, it's why do we like a real flower as opposed to a plastic one? You know, because it disappears. You know, and the disappearance of everything is somehow a beautiful thing, not just a depressing thing. But I think but what was more consoling to me, I think, was one of the things it provided, and I think you have to watch this a bit with the kind of moral philosophy of Buddhism, which is a very high bar, quite different from Alan Watts' philosophy. He was kind of hedonist, drunk, and adulterer. So his emphasis was not particularly on morality. He spent very little time on the noble truths, and sort of dismissed them. And his interest was in getting yourself to a condition which was always there and available to you. He was quite lampooned as a kind of fast food philosopher, because he said, there's nothing you have to do, it's there right now, all you've got to do is just make up your mind to be it. It wasn't about years of self-discipline. And the idea that if you just trusted yourself, you know, and acted according to that self-trust, you'll behave appropriately. And he's not necessarily well or badly, but appropriately. And his idea was all about sincerity. It was all about not pretending to be other than that which you were. And for him, he has another quote saying, "There's nothing more terrible than a saint." He very much distrusted people who held up high moral standards, and he quite correctly, in my view, pointed out all the great horrors of the 20th century have been perpetrated by people who believed they were doing the right thing, who were doing good things. And that he'd rather have somebody, you know, who wants to steal your land and your women and rape your children any day, rather than somebody who wants to impose an ideology on you, because that they will lay the world to waste in order to make that ideology true. He was more in favour of old-fashioned greed and lust, and I can see that point. So his morality, his moral theory is quite different, or his understanding of Buddhist moral theory is quite different. It's more Taoist. It's much less interested in being a good person.
Well, it's interesting, and you were saying...
So it's about guilt.
Yeah.
It's about... Yeah. So to come back to the question you asked me, I think I suffered quite a lot of guilt, and I don't feel that.
Yeah. Now, you were talking about Alan Watts, sort of like, didn't pay much attention to the Four Noble Truths, etc. Doesn't remind me... Some people might say that, okay, so one worry is that by bringing this kind of, in inverted commas, Western scientific analytic, approach to Buddhism, where sort of there's a clash of cultures and ways of thinking going on. I think that probably is underestimates the extent to which those things are already there. But there's another perhaps aspect of Western thinking, if you like, which might be going on here, which is that kind of consumerist pick and mix approach. That we're basically spiritually shopping around the world for things we like, and what people do when they encounter Buddhism is that they pick the bits that suit them and they like them, and they just discard the rest. Now, you may think there's nothing wrong with that. You may think there isn't. But when you're looking for a naturalised Buddhism, Owen, I mean, is that what you're doing? Are you picking and mixing, or are you doing something a little bit more, I don't know, what has a bit more integrity than that?
Well, yeah. I think that spiritually shopping is a thing that people do a lot of. And we used to call it being cafeteria Catholic or something like that, taking the crossing out certain commandments as old-fashioned and whatever. So I think one of the ideas, again, I wasn't concerned, and I still am not concerned about what Buddhists say in countries that are where they're perfectly comfortable believing that. I mean, just because I think what I find in lots of Southeast Asia, I go around Southeast Asia and I hang around with people like those people in this room, and I ask people at dinner, I say, why do you give the monks dana, gifts, food, offerings? And they'll say, for merit. And I'll push, because I'm a philosopher gadfly, and I say, what do you mean by merit? And they said, better rebirth. And then I say, do you really believe that you'll have rebirths? And they say, yes. So then I think, well, that's interesting fact about people in Thailand and Cambodia who I run across. Okay? Now, I don't think they should pay attention to science or think about themselves as material beings living in the material world and accept modern physics and cosmology. I'm more wondering about spiritual shoppers in North America and in Europe, because when Tibetan Buddhists, in 1959 was when the Dalai Lama, as a young man, and 40,000 Tibetan Buddhists came to North India. 10,000 of them came over to places like Germany and Switzerland. And there started to be then a lot of people converting to Tibetan Buddhism. Tibetan Buddhism is a little bit like the Roman Catholicism of Buddhism. There's more sort of idolatry. Okay, that's roughly, I think, correct, whereas Zen is the least so. So what I'm interested in is all these people who then become Tibetan Buddhists, and they say to me things like, I'm a Tibetan Buddhist. I say, oh, so do you believe in, and someone would say, they believe that? Really? Or they say, what I mostly do is I meditate all the time. I say, oh, the average time that even a monastic in Tibetan Buddhist tradition meditates is about 7 minutes a week, according to sociologists who study them. I said, really? Yeah. So I actually am sort of a participant. I'm wondering about exactly your question. And I kind of am wary of people who just climb on board without being serious to a tradition which is really, really rich. And I think typically, Alan Watts is exceptional here, morally very demanding, because among most Buddhists and Buddhist children, they read stories about bodhisattvas. Bodhisattvas are saints and sages who are maximally compassionate. And the way to get to final nirvana is supposedly that you have to reach bodhisattva stage, and then eventually you might be released. And these are people who do practice the 4 immeasurables. Compassion for all sentient beings, that is wanting to end suffering of all sentient beings. Loving kindness, wanting to bring well-being in its stead. You have a headache, I care for you, and I give you aspirin. I haven't made you happy yet, I just made you not have a headache. Then I do loving kindness. Then there's sympathetic joy, a completely non-Western virtue. It's being happy for you in a zero-sum game in which you won. You see this sometimes in the Wimbledon finals. That people will say, that was the best tennis match I was ever part of. The loser will say that. But it's very, very rare. And it has to do with gaining a sense of perspective about that my suffering is no more important than your suffering. And I think so. And then equanimity is the 4th of the immeasurables. And these are values which I think are quite beautiful, are good for us, and I think you have to probably understand yourself inside of Buddhist metaphysics to really appreciate them. So I guess the answer to your question is, I'm worried about people who just cherry pick meditation, and I think it's typically in my country anyway. I'll speak for most Americans. I mean, it's a way that antecedently nice and well-off people do things to make themselves feel a little bit nicer.
I very much like subscribing to the idea that I can one day feel compassion for all sentient beings. Someone steps on an ant in Kuala Lumpur and the other side of Ireland. Just don't see it happening. I think it's unrealistic. That's my problem. And one of the things that Watts was very keen on was saying, you can't be good by trying to be good. It doesn't happen that way. The more you try to be good, in a way, the less you are good, because you're doing it for selfish reasons. You're doing it so you can convince your ego that you're a good person. And so it's a bit of a double bind. The more, why are you trying to be good? What makes you want to be good? Is it so you can see yourself as a good person? Therefore, it's essentially egotistical activity. And thus he was very suspicious of anybody who set out to improve, you know, their karmic standing or tried to have compassion for the sentient beings. Or it was a kind of game that people who like to think of themselves as spiritual would play, kind of one-upmanship. You know, I'm less egotistical than you are, if you see what I mean.
Well, time is flying by. I do want to bring audience in, and this session is proving to be